I was standing in my own living room when my older sister raised her glass and announced, "I deserve the master bedroom, and honestly, this house should be half mine." My parents clapped as if she had spoken the truth of the century. Laughter erupted, neighbors nodded, and I stood there silent, watching them turn my home into a stage for my humiliation. No one defended me. No one thought I had the right to fight back, but they didn't know. Behind their sneers and their arrogance, I held a secret powerful enough to change everything that night. I grew up in a house where silence was louder than love. From the very beginning, my place in the family had been carved out for me, the shadow behind my sister's light. Diane was the golden child, the one whose report cards were framed, whose laugh was celebrated, whose mistakes were quickly forgiven and even romanticized. I was the afterthought. If she was the melody, I was the static in the background, necessary to fill space but never enough to be noticed. I still remember when I was 8 and won a small prize in a local art contest. My teacher had encouraged me to enter, and for the first time, I felt proud of something I had done on my own. I ran home clutching the certificate, my heart beating like I was carrying a crown. My mother barely looked at it before asking me to take Diane's dress to the cleaners for her recital. My father muttered, "That's nice, but Diane's got her piano performance coming up. Don't distract her." My little spark was smothered before it had a chance to breathe. It only grew worse with time. Every family dinner was another round of comparisons. Diane was praised for her elegance, her intelligence, her bright future. I was the one who still hadn't found herself. The words stung because they carried more than judgment. They carried a prophecy that everyone seemed eager to make true. I tried harder. I joined debate club. I studied late into the night. I worked part-time jobs to buy my own things. But no matter what I achieved, the verdict was always the same. Diane has the gift. Claire just doesn't have it. The wound deepened on my 16th birthday. I woke that morning with a quiet excitement, imagining a cake, maybe a small gift, or even just a simple, happy birthday. But the house was buzzing with energy, not for me, but for Diane. She had just been accepted into a prestigious private school, and the entire family was preparing a celebration. Relatives came over, balloons were tied, champagne glasses clinked. No one even looked at me. I sat at the edge of the living room listening to them toast her future while mine disappeared into silence. 16 candles should have been lit for me that night, but instead I blew out nothing at all. That moment changed me. I didn't cry in front of them, but something inside me fractured. I realized I wasn't simply unloved, I was invisible. And being invisible in your own family is a cruelty sharper than hate. As the years passed, the hierarchy became an unspoken law. Diane received the scholarships, the study abroad trips, the family car. When she failed a class, it was blamed on a difficult professor. When I earned a high grade, it was brushed off as luck. If Diane wanted something, it was given. If I asked, I was told, "We can't waste resources on you. You don't have the potential." The phrase, "you don't have the potential," became my prison. It followed me like a shadow, whispering in my ear whenever I dared to dream. I wanted to study architecture, but my father said, "That's too ambitious for you." I wanted to audition for theater, but my mother sighed, "That's not your path." Every door I tried to open was slammed shut with those words, and yet quietly, I started writing. In a notebook I kept hidden beneath my mattress, I poured out everything I couldn't say aloud. My frustrations, my anger, my silent vows. I wrote about the nights I cried into my pillow, about the envy I felt toward Diane, about the shame of never being enough. But I also wrote promises to myself. The clearest one was written in bold letters on a torn-out page. "One day they will see me." I clung to that sentence like a lifeline. Even as my parents dismissed me, even as Diane flaunted her superiority, I whispered it to myself in the dark, "One day they will see me." Looking back, I understand now that the disdain wasn't just careless cruelty. It was deliberate. My parents had chosen their champion, and I was never meant to compete. My role was to be the cautionary tale, the reminder of what failure looked like so Diane could shine brighter. But what they didn't realize was that every dismissal, every overlooked birthday, every cutting remark was forging something inside me they couldn't see. They thought they were proving my uselessness. In reality, they were planting the seeds of my determination. The night of my forgotten 16th birthday still lingers in my mind, replaying like a scene burned into film. I can hear the clinking glasses, the music, the laughter. I can see Diane glowing in the center of it all, the perfect daughter, the rising star. And I can see myself sitting in the corner, hands clenched around nothing, whispering a vow into the void. One day, you'll regret overlooking me. You know that feeling, don't you? That ache of being invisible in the place you should have been safest? That hollow in your chest when the people who are supposed to lift you up are the ones who push you down? That was my beginning, the root of everything, the soil of disdain in which I was planted. Leaving home was not a dramatic escape, but a quiet surrender. I packed my belongings into 2 worn suitcases and slipped out of the house one early morning, my parents still asleep, Diane still dreaming of her next triumph. I told myself I was leaving behind years of cruelty, but truthfully, I was also leaving behind the last hope of ever being seen by them. The air outside felt sharp, the streets cold, and yet that moment carried the first taste of freedom I had ever known. Freedom, however, was not comfort. I moved from one temporary job to another, waiting tables, cleaning offices, hauling boxes at a warehouse. The hours were long, the pay was barely enough for food, and there were nights when my only bed was the back seat of a rusted car I had bought, with what little I had saved. The springs dug into my back, the windows fogged with my breath, and I would lie awake listening to the city outside, wondering if this was truly all I was destined for. It didn't take long for my family to find out. One evening, my phone buzzed with Diane's number. I hesitated but answered, only to hear her laughter spilling through the line. "So it's true," she said, almost gleeful. "The great Claire Whitman sleeping in her car. I knew you'd never make it." My father's voice chimed in the background, cruel and dismissive. "She chose this path. Let her see what life really is. Our golden girl would never sink this low." The call ended with my mother sighing, "What a shame." That night, I curled beneath my thin blanket in the back seat and wept until my chest hurt. Their voices echoed in my head like a cruel chorus. Useless, failure, shame. I wanted to vanish. Yet in that very car, surrounded by nothing but exhaustion and despair, a small spark of clarity flickered inside me. I looked at the roof above me, scratched and lined with rust, and whispered, "This won't be my ending. This will be my beginning." But beginnings rarely look like victories. They look like grit, like hands cracked from labor, like nights when you eat the cheapest food you can find just to make rent. I stumbled through jobs, saving what I could, hiding my shame from everyone around me. My only refuge was the public library, where I discovered books on finance, real estate, and the biographies of people who had clawed their way up from nothing. I devoured them, page by page, as though each story carried a secret map out of my despair. One evening, while dozing off over a book, I met a woman named Margaret. She was older, sharp-eyed, with an aura of quiet authority. She glanced at the title in my hands, Principles of Real Estate Investment, and asked, "Are you studying for a career or just curious?" I almost laughed. A career. I was barely surviving. But something in her gaze made me answer honestly, "I don't know. I just don't want to feel powerless anymore." That answer must have struck something in her, because Margaret began meeting me regularly. She became my mentor, though I didn't call her that at the time. She taught me about markets, about risk, about how to see potential in places others dismissed. Her words planted seeds in my mind, seeds that began to grow despite the rocky soil of my life. Months later, I scraped together enough savings to place a down payment on a small, dilapidated apartment. It was risky, reckless even, but I believed it could be my first real step forward. I painted the walls myself, repaired the floorboards, and spent countless nights scrubbing away the grime of neglect. When I finally rented it out, I felt a rush unlike anything I had known before. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving. I was building. But life doesn't hand out victories without tests. My tenant stopped paying after 3 months, leaving the apartment damaged and the bills piling up. I had poured everything into that one chance, and now it seemed to crumble in my hands. I sat in the middle of that empty, wrecked apartment, the air thick with the smell of mold, and for the first time in years, I sobbed openly. My knees pulled to my chest, my arms wrapped around myself. I whispered, maybe they were right. Maybe I really don't have it. Yet even in that pit of despair, I couldn't let go of Margaret's words. Power comes from persistence, not perfection. Slowly, through tears and exhaustion, I realized that quitting would prove my family right, and I refused to give them that satisfaction. I stood up, wiped my face, and began making calls. I found contractors willing to work cheaply, negotiated repairs, and learned the painful lessons of contracts and legal protections. It was messy, humiliating at times, but with every step I grew sharper, stronger. The failure that had almost destroyed me became the foundation of my resilience. That apartment, broken as it was, taught me something priceless. Success isn't about one big win. It's about surviving the falls and daring to climb again. And so, in that ruined room where I thought everything had ended, I made myself another vow. This is not the end. This is where the empire begins. The first time I felt the ground shift beneath me was when I sold that small apartment for nearly twice what I had invested. It wasn't luck, though outsiders might have thought so. It was months of sweat, mistakes, and sleepless nights poured into 4 walls and a leaky ceiling. When the deal closed, the check in my hand felt heavier than paper. It felt like proof that I wasn't the useless daughter my family branded me to be. Proof that I could carve out a place in the world on my own terms. But I didn't tell them. Not a word. While other people might have celebrated, I tucked the success deep inside like a private jewel. My parents still thought I was drifting between menial jobs, and Diane still boasted about her prestigious career path, and I let them believe it. Because for once their ignorance was my protection. With the profit from that sale, I bought 2 more properties. Small, neglected homes others overlooked. Each was a battle, negotiating with reluctant sellers, haggling with contractors, fixing problems I barely understood. But each challenge sharpened me. Slowly, the fear of failure gave way to something sturdier. Competence. With every signed contract and every closed deal, my confidence grew brick by brick, just like the buildings I restored. Soon I wasn't just surviving, I was moving strategically. I registered a company under a discreet name, creating a shell that allowed me to work without attaching my face to every deal. I built a team, an accountant who believed in numbers more than promises, a lawyer who thrived in finding loopholes, and a few ambitious contractors who trusted me enough to take risks. None of them knew the full story of where I came from. All they knew was that I delivered. My world expanded into circles I had never imagined myself belonging to. At networking events, I was no longer the invisible sister. I was a name whispered with curiosity. Political figures sought my company. Lawyers nodded respectfully when I spoke, and seasoned investors leaned in to hear my perspective. I was no longer standing on the margins. I was at the table. The transformation was intoxicating, but it came with its own kind of loneliness. I moved through sleek boardrooms and glass towers, yet every victory was mine to celebrate alone. At night, in the quiet of my apartment, I sometimes wondered what it would be like if I could share this with my family. Would they finally look at me with pride? Would they finally say, "We were wrong about you?" That thought always dissolved quickly. I knew the answer. Recognition from them was a mirage I had chased too long. So I buried the desire deep and replaced it with strategy. The more I accumulated, the more invisible I became to them. To the outside world, I was growing into a formidable businesswoman. To my family, I was still Claire, the failure, the one without potential, the forgotten daughter. They never asked questions, never looked deeper, and I never corrected them. The irony reached its peak during a holiday gathering. I hadn't visited in months, but I stopped by briefly with a neutral smile, sitting quietly as Diane boasted about her recent promotion. At some point, my father laughed and said to a family friend, "Diane is our pride. And Claire? Well, she's just a secretary somewhere still trying to figure life out. Laughter followed, light and dismissive. I felt the sting, but it didn't cut the way it used to. Instead, it almost amused me. I pictured the stack of property deeds locked in my office drawer, the contracts worth millions signed under my name, the empire no one in that room could even fathom. They thought I was invisible. In truth, I was a storm they hadn't seen coming. That night, as I drove back to the city, I laughed aloud for the first time in months. It wasn't bitter laughter. It was release. Let them think I was nothing. Let them tell their friends their youngest daughter was a secretary. The higher they underestimated me, the harder the ground would shake when they finally discovered who I had become. By then, my company had grown into more than just me. I had employees, projects that stretched across neighborhoods, and the beginnings of political leverage. I had built a quiet fortress of influence, one brick at a time. But I never flaunted it. I lived modestly, dressed simply, and remained discreet. Power, I had learned, was strongest when it was invisible until the moment it was needed. And so, while Diane preened under the family spotlight, I sharpened my tools in the shadows. While my parents paraded her around as the perfect child, I stitched together a network strong enough to topple empires. My plan wasn't vengeance, at least not in the way they might have feared. My plan was patience. To build something so undeniable that when the truth surfaced, their disbelief would shatter louder than any insult they had ever hurled at me. I closed my notebook one night, the same one I had been writing in since I was a teenager, and scrawled a new promise under the old vow. They think I'm nothing. Let them. When the time comes, they won't just see me. They'll bow to me. And with that, I returned to work, the laughter of my family still echoing in my memory. Not as pain anymore, but as fuel. It began subtly, the way an earthquake rumbles before the ground splits open. My parents called one afternoon, their voices laced with frailty and guilt. They said they were getting older, that maintaining their house had become too much, that they needed me. I hesitated, but old habits die hard, and the part of me still craving their approval softened. I told them they could stay with me temporarily. At least, that was the agreement. They arrived with suitcases, furniture, and an air of ownership. Within days, my home no longer felt like mine. My mother rearranged the kitchen without asking. My father claimed the study as his reading room. When I tried to push back gently, I was met with a scoff. "Family shares everything, Claire. This is our home, too." And then came Diane. She showed up as if summoned, her luggage rolling behind her, her perfume filling the hallway. She didn't ask, she announced, "The master bedroom suits me better. I'll take it." I laughed at first, thinking it was another one of her spoiled jokes, but she wasn't smiling. My parents nodded in agreement, saying, "It makes sense, Claire. She deserves comfort." I stood there in my own house, feeling the walls close in. I wanted to scream, to throw them all out then and there, but decades of conditioning made me swallow the words. I let them walk over me again, convincing myself it was easier to endure than to ignite a war. The war found me anyway. It was during a family gathering, the kind of event where every relative, every neighbor, every long-forgotten acquaintance crowded into one room. My parents had insisted on hosting it at my house, insisting it was tradition. I agreed, though unease clung to me like smoke. The living room buzzed with chatter, glasses clinked, and laughter rolled across the walls. I hovered near the edge, invisible as always, until Diane raised her voice above the crowd. She stood in the center, holding her drink as though it were a microphone. "Let's be honest," she said, her smile sharp. "This house should be half mine. After all, Claire wouldn't even survive without this family. She owes everything to us." The room erupted in laughter. My mother clapped, my father smirked proudly, and relatives nodded in agreement. I felt heat rush to my face, shame pressing down on me like a physical weight. I opened my mouth, but before I could speak, Diane cut me down again. "Look at her. She's nearly 40, no husband, no children, nothing to show for herself. If not for us, she'd be on the streets." The words landed like knives, each one sharper than the last. My stomach twisted. Around me, people chuckled, exchanged knowing glances, whispered judgments. They saw me not as a host in her own home, but as an object of ridicule, a cautionary tale wrapped in flesh. I clenched my hands, nails digging into my palms, trying to anchor myself against the humiliation. Memories of sleeping in my car flashed before me, the sting of Diane's laughter on the phone, my father's dismissive voice calling me a failure. They were weaving all those old wounds into the present, and for a moment, I felt like that invisible teenager again, sitting in the corner while the world toasted Diane's glory. But then something shifted inside me. Beneath the shame was a simmering strength, the kind forged through years of being underestimated. I raised my eyes and looked at Diane. For the first time, I didn't see her as untouchable. I saw her as fragile, desperate to cling to the pedestal my parents had built for her. She must have seen the change in my gaze, because her voice grew louder, harsher, as if trying to drown out the silence between us. She jabbed a finger toward me. If it weren't for this family, you'd be nothing, nothing. The crowd hushed, waiting for my collapse. I felt the tension crackle in the air, the judgment heavy on every breath. And then, from the back of the room, a voice cut through the silence, calm, firm, and strangely amused. "Is that true?" the man asked, stepping forward slowly. His suit was tailored, his presence commanding, his expression unreadable. "Are you certain she'd be nothing without you?" All eyes turned toward him, whispers spreading like fire. My heart pounded as recognition dawned. This wasn't just any guest. This was someone with power, someone who knew me beyond the version my family paraded. I didn't move, I didn't speak, but inside, I felt the first stirrings of the storm that was about to break. The room fell into a hush as the man stepped forward, his presence commanding silence in a way no one else could. I knew him well, Robert Kane, one of the most influential real estate developers in the city, a man whose signature on a contract could change entire neighborhoods. He was also my business partner, though no one in this room had the faintest clue. Robert set down his glass, his eyes sweeping across the crowd before landing on Diane. "You claim your sister is nothing without you," he said evenly, "but perhaps you should ask yourself who you would be without her." Confusion flickered across Diane's face, then irritation. "Excuse me, who even are you?" she demanded, her voice rising, though it wavered slightly under the weight of his composure. He smiled faintly, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I am the man who has worked with Claire Whitman on projects that your newspapers call miracles. The derelict land on Westbridge, the luxury high-rises on Oak Street, the revitalized riverfront. None of that would exist without her vision." He turned to the crowd. "This woman," he gestured toward me, "is the mastermind who turned wastelands into gold." Gasps rippled through the room, glasses froze halfway to lips. My parents' smiles collapsed into slack-jawed disbelief. Diane blinked rapidly as if she hadn't heard him correctly. Robert wasn't finished. And here you are, in her home, mocking her, taking credit for her survival, when in truth she is the reason hundreds of families have homes today. She is the reason investors like me trust this city's potential. Without Claire, much of what you see rising around you would still be rubble. A murmur spread, then grew louder, shifting the air in the room. Neighbors who had laughed at me minutes earlier now stared with wide eyes. Relatives who had nodded along with Diane's mockery whispered my name with awe, as though they were seeing me for the first time. Diane's face drained of color, but she recovered quickly, reaching for arrogance the way a drowning person grabs for driftwood. "You're exaggerating, Claire. She's always been a failure." Her voice cracked on the last word, betraying her fear. Robert raised an eyebrow. "Strange, then, that the company you're so eager to join has her listed as one of its principal investors." The silence that followed was deafening. Diane froze, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The crowd erupted into stunned whispers. My parents' eyes darted between Robert and me, desperate for denial, for some way to rewrite the truth. I stepped forward then, my voice calm but steady, carrying over the noise. "It's true. The The firm you've been begging for an interview with, Diane, I own a significant share of it. Every project you've envied from afar, every headline you've clipped to brag about, my fingerprints are on all of it." Her glass slipped from her hand, shattering against the floor. No one laughed now. The world had tilted, and the hierarchy that had ruled my family for decades crumbled in an instant. My mother clutched her chest, whispering, "This can't be real." My father, usually so quick with dismissive remarks, stood silent, his jaw working, but no sound emerging. The proud architects of my invisibility were watching the walls of their reality collapse, and they had no tools to rebuild it. Diane stumbled forward, her voice trembling. "Claire, I didn't mean—" She reached for me, the same sister who had just declared I was nothing. "You know, I've always believed in you, right? We were just joking. Family teases, that's all." Her desperation almost made me laugh, but I didn't. I only looked at her, the weight of years pressing between us. Behind her mask of arrogance was fear. Fear of irrelevance, of losing the pedestal she'd balanced on all her life. The guests shifted, some glancing at me with admiration, others at my family with pity. A neighbor muttered, "All this time. And they treated her like that." Another whispered, "I can't believe Diane thought she could take her house." The tide had turned completely. Diane's arrogance cracked, and suddenly she was begging. "Claire, please, you have connections, you have power. Help me get that job. Don't let one silly fight ruin us." Her hands shook as she tried to reach mine. I didn't move. The humiliation I had endured, the birthdays forgotten, the endless dismissals, they all stood between us like an iron wall. The old Claire would have folded, desperate for acceptance, but I wasn't her anymore. I leaned in slightly, my voice quiet but sharp enough to slice through the noise. "You built your life on believing I was beneath you. Now tell me, Diane, what happens to you when that foundation is gone?" Her eyes filled with tears, but I offered no comfort. The room was silent except for the sound of her breath hitching. My parents sat stone-faced, realizing that the roles they had forced upon us had reversed in a single evening. For once, I wasn't invisible. For once, they couldn't look past me. But as the crowd stared, waiting for my next move, I felt the weight of choice pressing on me. I could humiliate them further, strip Diane of every opportunity, crush the pedestal once and for all. Or I could walk away, leaving them to crumble under their own shame. The decision lingered on my tongue, a knife's edge between vengeance and restraint, and I wasn't sure which way I would lean. The silence after my words hung thick, broken only by the sound of Diane's shallow breaths. My parents finally stirred, their proud facades cracking like old porcelain. My mother reached out, tears running down her cheeks. "Claire, we didn't mean it. We were just mistaken. We didn't know how successful you'd become. Please don't let one misunderstanding break this family." My father's voice, usually firm, trembled. "We did what we thought was best. Diane needed support, and you seemed fine on your own. Maybe we pushed too hard, but it was love in its own way." His words rang hollow, excuses wrapped in parental authority, but for the first time, his tone carried fear. Diane, her mascara streaked, collapsed to her knees in front of me. "Please, Claire, don't ruin me. I didn't mean what I said. I was jealous, insecure. You've always been stronger than me. Help me. I'll do anything." The sight might have satisfied someone else, but inside me, emotions warred. This was what I had once dreamed of, my family finally seeing me, begging for my forgiveness. Yet standing there, it felt empty. Their apologies were not born from realization but from desperation. They weren't sorry for the years they had belittled me. They were sorry because now they needed me. I inhaled slowly, my chest heavy with the weight of history. "Blood," I said softly, "doesn't give you the right to trample me. You use that bond as a weapon, not as love. And now you ask for forgiveness as if words can erase years of scars." My mother sobbed harder. My father lowered his gaze, and Diane clutched at the hem of my dress like a child terrified of being left behind. For a moment, I felt the sting of tears in my own eyes. I wasn't cold and I wasn't untouched. They were still my family, the people whose approval I had once begged for. The ache of that longing pressed against my ribs, even as my resolve held firm. Later, after the guests had dispersed in uneasy silence, I sat alone in the quiet of my study. A framed photograph caught my eye, one from childhood, the three of us sisters with our parents on a summer day. Diane's smile beamed, wide and full of pride, while mine was smaller, uncertain. Looking at that younger version of myself, I felt a wave of sorrow so sharp it blurred my vision. Tears slipped down my cheeks as I whispered, "I'm sorry you had to grow up unseen, but we made it. We're here now." I let myself cry, truly cry, not out of weakness, but out of mourning for what had been lost and could never be reclaimed. And then I placed the photograph back on the shelf, turned off the light, and left the room without looking back. The next morning, I dressed simply, choosing a quiet dignity over extravagance. My parents and Diane lingered in the living room, their faces pale from sleeplessness. None of them dared to demand now. They waited, hope and dread written across their expressions. I stood at the threshold and spoke calmly, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. "You can no longer live here. This house is mine, and so is the life I built. I won't allow you to take from me what you never gave." My mother cried out. My father muttered protests. Diane whispered promises, but I didn't waver. I turned and walked toward the door, their voices fading behind me. With each step, I felt the weight of chains breaking, links forged by decades of disdain snapping free. When I opened the front door, sunlight streamed across my face. For a moment, the contrast was almost overwhelming, the darkness of the night before colliding with the brilliance of a new beginning. I paused, remembering the girl I once was, forgotten on her 16th birthday, huddled in a car with nothing but scraps of hope, desperate for love that never came. And then I saw her, in my mind's eye, standing beside me. That girl lifted her chin as if to say, "You did it. You became everything they said you couldn't be." I stepped forward, leaving behind the crumbling world of their control and into the life I had claimed for myself. My lips curved into a smile, not of triumph, but of peace. The future stretched before me like an open road, unmarked and waiting. And as I walked away, I turned the question outward, not to them, but to you, watching, listening, remembering. If it were you, standing where I stood, would you turn back to embrace those who broke you, or would you keep walking and never look over your shoulder again?